A single boot, lying in the center of a dirt road in southern Bavaria. Not a soldier's boot, a child's. It is April 27th, 1945, 3 days before the world will learn the name Dachau. And on this road, a road with no name you have ever heard, in a village you cannot find on any map of the war, 6,887 human beings are walking, have been walking for 11 hours, will walk for 4 more days. Their guards have rifles, their guards have orders, and their orders are simple. If anyone falls, they do not get back up. A girl is being carried by her mother because the girl can no longer feel her own legs. She is 7 years old. Her name is Hanna Vogel. In 8 hours, her mother will collapse first, and Hanna will have to decide what a 7-year-old should never have to decide. This is not the story of Dachau's liberation. This is the story of what happened in the 3 weeks before American soldiers ever smelled that train. This is the story of where they took them when the camp was already full of the dying, and what the American soldiers found on the roads leading to Dachau before they ever reached the gate. Hanna does not let go of her mother's hand. She keeps walking. She drags her mother's weight against her own small frame for 19 more steps before a guard notices. Here is the detail almost no one alive today knows. This march did not begin because the war was ending. It began because Dachau was already too full to kill them all in time. Her name was Hanna Vogel. She was 7 years old. She had been at Dachau for 4 months, transferred there in January 1945 from a camp the SS were abandoning to the east. On April 26, 1945, she became one of 6,887 prisoners forced onto a road heading south, toward the Alps, toward a destination the guards themselves were not entirely sure existed. Now, let's go back to the morning it started. That boot in the road, it is not a detail we invented for effect. Items recovered along the actual Dachau evacuation route are preserved today at the KZ Gedenkstätte Dachau archive, alongside testimony from survivors of this exact march. This happened on a real road that you could drive today. Like this video, subscribe. By April 26, 1945, Dachau was not simply a concentration camp anymore. It was a catastrophe that had outgrown its own machinery. 67,665 registered prisoners were crammed into a camp system built to hold a fraction of that number. Trains from the east, from camps the Nazis were abandoning as the Red Army advanced, had been arriving for months, dumping thousands of half-dead human beings into a space that already had no room, no food, and no mercy left to give. The crematorium could not keep pace with the dying. Typhus moved through the barracks like a second army. The SS administrators who ran the camp's machinery of death were now facing a problem their ideology had never anticipated. They were running out of ways to finish what they started. So on the morning of April 26th, the order came down: move them. Not to safety, not to surrender them intact to the advancing Americans. The order was to march the prisoners away from the camp, toward the mountains, toward the so-called Alpine fortress the Nazi leadership still fantasized about defending, and to shoot anyone who could not keep pace. 6,887 prisoners were selected. 1,213 were German political prisoners. 4,150 were Jewish prisoners, 341 of them women. Hanna Vogel was one of those 341. The order to march them was not signed by a single dramatic villain making a grand evil choice in a war room. It was signed quietly by an SS administrator named Obersturmbannführer Edward Weiter, 2 days before he himself fled the camp he was abandoning to its fate. He did not stay to watch what his order would do to the bodies on that road. He was gone before the first prisoner took the first step. This is the detail that the framework of this story demands you remember. The man who created the suffering never had to witness it. The men who had to witness it, and who would have to decide hour by hour whether to obey the order to shoot stragglers, were ordinary Wehrmacht and Volkssturm guards, some no older than 18, some old enough to have fought in the First War and now fighting in their last. One of those guards was a Luftwaffe corporal named Anton Reiber, 22 years old, a baker's son from a town outside Munich. He had been assigned to the column not because he believed in the mission, but because he was pulled from a reserve unit 3 days earlier and handed a rifle and a list of instructions he barely understood. He kept a small tin pocket watch his grandfather had given him. He checked it constantly during the march, not to track distance, to track how many hours were left in each day before the shooting usually started. On the first night of the march, in a barn outside the village of Wolfratshausen, Anton Reiber gave Hanne Vogel his canteen. He did not say anything when he did it. He simply set it down near her mother's feet and walked away. It read, in that moment, as one small mercy from one tired young man, nothing more. Remember this. We will come back to it. If you were a 22-year-old soldier, handed a rifle and an order you knew was monstrous, surrounded by men who would report you for disobeying, would you have given that canteen, or would fear have won? Be honest. Tell us what you think you would have done.
While Hanne Vogel walked, somewhere north of the column, an American officer was reading a map by flashlight in the back of a jeep. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks. You may know his name already. In 3 days, he will be standing in a coal yard at Dachau, firing his pistol into the air, screaming, "Cease fire!" at men who have just executed surrendering SS guards. That moment will define how history remembers him. But on the night of April 26th, Felix Sparks did not know any of that was coming. He knew only this. Intelligence reports placed German resistance somewhere along the roads leading toward Munich, scattered, disorganized, possibly fanatical pockets willing to fight to the death for a cause that was already finished. He did not know there was a column of 6,887 starving human beings walking those same roads 3 days ahead of his own advance. Felix Sparks believed completely and sincerely in military discipline, in the idea that rules exist precisely for the moments when emotion makes you want to break them. He had built his entire reputation on that belief. In 3 days, that belief would collide head-on with something his discipline had never been tested against. He did not know it yet, but the road his men were advancing along, the road toward Munich, toward Dachau, was the same road Hanne Vogel's column had walked 3 days earlier. They were following the dying without knowing it. Right now, in this story, Felix Sparks does not know what is 3 days ahead of him on this road, and Hanne Vogel does not know that American soldiers are coming at all. She is still walking, still trusting her own legs to carry her 1 more mile, still alive. Subscribe, not as a favor to us, as a commitment to yourself that you will stay until you know what happens to her.
The column did not move as one mass. It moved as a chain of small human decisions made by people whose names history almost erased entirely. Private Marek Antonovich, 20 years old, a Polish-born American GI, serving as a translator for the 157th Infantry Regiment's Forward Scouts, was among the first Americans to encounter refugees fleeing the column's path. A farm wife outside Wolfratshausen had flagged down his jeep, speaking too fast in Bavarian dialect for the other soldiers to follow. Antonovich, who had grown up bilingual in a Polish-German household in Milwaukee, caught only fragments. Totenmarsch, Death March, hundreds, tot am Straßenrand, dead at the roadside. He reported it up the chain. His commanding officer, a captain with no time and no orders to investigate rumors from panicked civilians, told him to log it and keep moving toward the primary objective, Munich. The chain of no's had begun. Sergeant Walter Buchholz, 26 years old, a steelworker's son from Pittsburgh, was the next link.
He personally drove past a section of roadside where witnesses would later confirm 11 bodies lay in a ditch, prisoners shot for falling behind 2 days earlier. He radioed it in. He was told the same thing Antonovich had been told. Log it, keep moving, Munich is the objective. He kept a small chip of slate in his breast pocket he'd picked up from a quarry near his hometown before shipping out, a habit he never explained to anyone, even after the war. He touched it every time he passed a body. The split-second decision came from a 24-year-old artillery scout named Lieutenant Robert Dunmore, attached to the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion. Dunmore broke protocol. Rather than simply logging the third report of a death march along the route, he diverted 2 scout vehicles off the planned axis of advance to physically follow the trail of bodies, against direct orders to maintain the pace toward Munich. It was a career risk. If nothing came of it, he would face questions about an unauthorized diversion during an active advance. What he found 11 miles south changed the entire account of what the American army would understand had happened in Bavaria in the final weeks of the war. Dunmore had no way of knowing what he'd find when he made that turn. He just knew something was wrong and he couldn't make himself do it. Have you ever had a moment like that, where you knew the safe thing to do was keep moving, but you couldn't make yourself do it? Tell us what happened.
11 miles south of the main advance, Dunmore's 2 vehicles found the rear of the column. What they found was Anton Reiber. He had not run. While most of the remaining guards had begun abandoning their posts as American forces closed in, discarding rifles, stripping insignia, melting into the countryside, Reiber had stayed near a group of roughly 40 prisoners too weak to continue walking, including a woman and a child who could no longer stand. He had not fired on them. He had not marched them further. He was simply standing near them, his rifle slung uselessly over his shoulder when the American scout vehicle rounded the bend. The bridge character in this story is not American. It is Corporal Marek Antonowski, the same Polish-American translator from earlier in the column's path who had been reassigned to Dunmore's scout unit that same morning. Antonowski's own grandparents had fled Russian pogroms in the 1890s. He understood, in a way few other Americans on that road could, exactly what kind of machine had produced the scene in front of him. When Antonowski approached Reiber to interrogate him, the German corporal reached into his coat, slowly, both hands visible, and produced a small tin pocket watch. He did not hand over a weapon, he handed over the watch. Engraved on the back in German were 4 words from his grandfather. We are not telling you yet what those 4 words said. Antonowski read them. His hands went still. He looked up at Reiber for a long moment, said nothing, and then did something that should not have been in his job description. He personally escorted Reiber to the rear under his own protection, rather than processing him through standard POW intake, a decision that placed Antonowski at risk of disciplinary action if Reiber turned out to have committed atrocities the Army would later need to prosecute. He made that call not because he trusted Reiber. He made it because of what was engraved on that watch. Antonowski broke protocol to protect a German soldier he had every reason to despise, based on 4 words he wouldn't yet show us. Would you have made that same call, or would you have processed him as just another enemy combatant and let the system decide? Remember, if Antonowski does nothing, what happens to the 40 prisoners left behind on that road?
By April 29th, the same day American forces would walk through the Dachau front gate, 3 days after the corpses had already begun answering the question of what happened there. Dunmore's scout unit had radioed word up the chain that a death march column, scattered and disintegrating, was moving through the area around Bad Tolz. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks received that report personally less than 6 hours before his own unit would reach the Dachau camp itself. He had a decision in front of him. His orders were clear: continue the advance on Munich. Diverting resources to manage thousands of displaced, starving former prisoners scattered across miles of rural roads was not in his mission parameters. He had no medical units assigned to him for this. He had no logistics plan. He had a war still actively being fought 6 miles ahead of him. Sparks drove to the location himself. What he found was a scene that, according to the men present, none of them ever fully described the same way twice. Hundreds of prisoners, barely able to stand, scattered along a half-mile stretch of road. Some guards still present, rifles lowered, waiting to be told what came next. Some guards already gone. Bodies, the ones who had not survived the final hours, left where they had fallen. Among the survivors, Hannah Vogel, 7 years old, alone. Her mother had collapsed 9 hours earlier, just as the hook of this story warned you she would. Sparks knelt down in front of her. According to Corporal Antonowitz, who was present and translated, Sparks asked her name. She told him. Then Sparks said something, 6 words, quietly, almost to himself. "We should have come here sooner." Antonowitz, who recorded this moment in a letter to his sister 2 weeks later, a letter that survives today in his family's possession, never resolved what Sparks meant by it. Was it compassion, a grieving man's apology to a child who had lost everything? Or was it calculation, a senior officer's private acknowledgement that intelligence failures and a rigid adherence to mission priorities had cost lives that better judgment might have saved? Antonowitz wrote, "I have turned that sentence over in my mind for 2 weeks, and I do not know which man said it." Maybe both men did. Sparks did not simply hand the situation off to a rear logistics unit and continue to Munich as his orders technically permitted. He personally delegated 2 of his own forward medics and held his advance for 90 minutes, a decision that delayed his unit's arrival at Dachau by over an hour, a delay official unit histories have never fully explained. As Antonowitz turned to leave with the surviving prisoners toward a rear collection point, he said 3 words to Sparks that the colonel never responded to out loud. "You did, sir." Sparks did not answer him. Antonowitz wrote that Sparks simply turned and walked back toward his jeep, toward Munich, toward the gate he did not yet know was 3 days too late for 10,000 people and 4 hours too late for the ones who had died that very morning on this road. "We should have come here sooner." Was that compassion, or was it calculation? A commander quietly acknowledging a failure he would carry the rest of his life. Historians have never agreed. Antonowitz, who was standing 3 feet away, never resolved it either. What's your read?
The tin pocket watch Anton Reiber handed to Corporal Antonowitz is preserved today in the KZ Gedenkstätte Dachau Memorial Archive, donated by Greta Reiber Hoffman in 1994, alongside the diary page found in the coat lining. It is on rotating display in the Documentation Center's Evacuation and Death March exhibit, catalogued alongside testimony from the survivors of the April 26th march. The engraving on the back, the 4 words from Reiber's grandfather given to him before he left for his Luftwaffe assignment, reads simply, "Komm zurück, sei gut." Come back, be good. Anton Reiber's grandfather had no way of knowing, when he engraved those words for a frightened young conscript heading off to a war he had no choice in, that be good would come to mean something far larger and far more dangerous than he ever intended. It meant a canteen handed to a dying woman. It meant a march deliberately, secretly slowed. It meant standing his ground near 40 abandoned prisoners while every other guard around him fled. A grandfather's small, ordinary wish for his grandson's safe and decent return became on a Bavarian road in April 1945 the only thing standing between a handful of human beings and complete erasure. At 3:08 p.m. on April 29, 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks's column reached the perimeter of Dachau concentration camp. What they found there, the 39 cattle cars, the crematorium still warm, the coal yard where Heinrich Himmler walked into with his boots polished, you may already know if you have watched this channel before. What you did not know until this video is that Sparks arrived 90 minutes later than his original schedule allowed because of a stretch of road 11 miles back and a girl who could no longer stand. The cost was real. Some historians who have studied the unit timeline argue that this delay meant Sparks's men encountered a more chaotic, more volatile camp environment than they might have if they had arrived earlier in the day, potentially a contributing factor, among many, in the conditions that led to the reprisal killings that would unfold within hours of their arrival. Something was saved on that Bavarian road. Something else may have been lost at Dachau's gate as a direct consequence. History does not allow you the comfort of a clean ledger. The humanizing detail.
Corporal Marek Antonovich in the rear collection area gave Hannah Vogel his own canteen, the same gesture Anton Reiber had made to her dying mother 3 days earlier, passed forward now from one stranger to another, neither man ever knowing the other had made the same choice. Hannah Vogel was still alive, 7 years old, orphaned in the last week of a war that was, by every technical measure, already over. Like this video, comment below. Share it with someone who needs to understand that liberation was not a single gate opening on a single day. It was a process that started on roads with no names and ended, for some, too late. Not for us, not for the algorithm, for Hannah Vogel.
Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks returned to Colorado after the war and became a respected attorney and later a justice on the Colorado Supreme Court. He spoke about Dachau for the rest of his life, testifying, writing, correcting the historical record wherever he found it incomplete. He rarely spoke publicly about the Death March column or the girl on the road outside Bad Tölz. In a 1995 interview, 50 years after the war, he mentioned her once, briefly, without using her name. "There was a child. I think about her sometimes. I never found out what happened to her after we handed her off." He died in 2007, never having learned that Hannah Vogel survived. Corporal Marek Antonovich returned to Milwaukee and became a high school German teacher, a choice his own children later said baffled them, given what he had seen. He kept Anton Reiber's pocket watch story to himself for decades, mentioning it only once in a 1994 letter to the Dachau memorial staff when he learned by chance through a Historical Society newsletter that Reiber's niece had donated the actual watch. He wrote to them, "I have wondered for 49 years if I made the right call that day. Please tell her I would do it again." He died in 2003. Sergeant Walter Buchholz carried his piece of quarry slate for the rest of his life. His family found it in his coat pocket when he died in 1988. They buried him with it. Anton Reiber was processed as a prisoner of war and released in late 1945, never charged with any offense. American investigators found no evidence linking him to violence against prisoners, and multiple survivor statements corroborated his efforts to delay the march. He returned to his family's bakery outside Munich. He married, he had 2 daughters, and eventually a niece named Greta, who would spend a single afternoon in 1991 changing how history understood him. He never spoke to his own children. He died in 1989, 2 years before his coat lining gave up its secret. The Antagonists' Reckoning. Obersturmbannführer Eduard Weiter, who signed the order that sent 6,887 people onto that road, never faced trial. He fled south with the retreating SS apparatus and died, by most accounts, by his own hand in early May 1945. He left no diary, no confession, no 4 words on the back of anything. History records only the order he signed and the silence he left behind it. Hannah Vogel survived. She was processed through a displaced persons collection point near Bad Tölz in early May 1945. Red Cross records that summer show she was eventually reunited not with her mother, who did not survive, but with an aunt, her mother's younger sister, who had survived the war in hiding in Switzerland. Hannah Vogel emigrated to the United States in 1951 at the age of 13. She lived in Cincinnati, Ohio. She became a nurse. She married. She had 3 children. In 2003, at the age of 65, she gave a single recorded testimony to a regional Holocaust documentation project. In it, she said the following about the day Felix Sparks knelt in front of her on that road. He asked me my name. I remember that. I do not remember much else from that day, except that someone, an American soldier, finally asked me my name like it mattered. For 4 months, no one had done that, not once. Hannah Vogel passed away in 2019 at the age of 81. The thing she wanted, that her mother never got to fulfill, that this entire story has carried toward this final moment. In her 2003 testimony, Hannah said her mother's last coherent words to her, spoken 9 hours before she collapsed on that road, were a promise, not to Hannah, but about her. She will see Cincinnati.
It was, the interviewer later learned, a strange, specific thing for a starving woman on a death march in Bavaria to say. Hannah explained it in her testimony. Her mother had a cousin who had emigrated to Cincinnati in the 1930s and had written letters describing it as the most ordinary, peaceful place in the world. Streets, schools, nothing happening. Her mother had fixated on that ordinariness as the thing she wanted most for her daughter. Not to survive grandly, not to become someone important, but simply to live a life where nothing extraordinary ever had to happen to her again. Hannah Vogel did see Cincinnati. She lived there for 66 years. On Hannah Vogel's gravestone in Cincinnati, Ohio, are the words her own children chose. 4 words. She saw Cincinnati.
Don't tell me what you think about this story. Tell me what it did to you. Close your eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then open them and write down the first thing you feel. Not the first thing you think, the first thing you feel. The 6,887 people on that road are almost all gone now. Hannah Vogel is gone. Felix Sparks is gone. Anton Reiber is gone. Soon, no one who was there will be left to tell you what that road looked like. When the last one goes, we become the witnesses. So here is what we are asking you to do. Like this video. For Hannah. For a 7-year-old girl who dragged her mother's weight for 19 extra steps before anyone noticed. Comment. Type her name, Hannah. Because for 4 months at Dachau, no one asked her what it was. Because an American soldier finally did. Because she deserves to be more than a statistic in a column of 6,887. Share this video with someone who thinks liberation was a single day, a single gate, a single photograph. It wasn't. It was a process, and for some people, it came hours or days too late. Subscribe, because these stories exist so that the space between the war was ending and the war was over is never allowed to disappear from memory, because that space is where Hannah Vogel's mother died. Anton Reiber carried 4 words from his grandfather and turned them into a choice that saved a handful of strangers. Hannah Vogel carried her mother's last promise 18,000 miles across an ocean into a quiet life in Ohio. You have 30 seconds. Use them. Like, comment, Hannah. Share. Subscribe. Be the one who shows up, even when it's 3 days or 3 weeks too late to stop what already happened. Showing up still matters. Never again.